Sling and Things.
Sup? How goes it? Me, lately I've been kind of stressed out. It happens. Especially when you're recording in the middle of a historic global pandemic, like I am right now. And when you're stressed out, when you're feeling down, it's hard to create things sometimes. It's hard to work on stuff when you feel like you've got this invisible weight on your shoulders that's getting in the way of your productivity, when you feel like you're not capable of living up to your standards. And the funk I was in, / have been in lately, was so deep that I decided to take my own advice from episode 10 and watch a horror movie to try to snap out of it. But not just any horror movie. A horror movie I had been holding off seeing even longer than 1408. A film that, needless to say, did the trick, if only temporarily. Because if it didn't, I wouldn't be talking right now. The movie in question that I saw is none other than The Descent from 2005, which was directed by Neil Marshall and which stars Shauna McDonald. The Descent is about 6 women who go down into a cave in the middle of nowhere, as one does in movies like this, and in the midst of their spelunking, or caving, they get stuck miles underground, in a cave where no one knows where they are, and as if that wasn't bad enough, they then encounter something, or someone, that lives down there that wants to kill them. And the reason I resisted watching this for so long is that I am kind of claustrophobic, and the idea of watching people try to escape from a deadly situation when they're underground, in a cave, in the dark, was always intimidating to me, even more so than whatever it could have been that was picking them off down there. And sure enough, it was still very uncomfortable for me to watch these characters go in between these crevices. Like, God bless whoever does this in real life, because no way. I am all for getting out of the house and hanging out with people, but if my friends were like, hey, let's go into an undiscovered cave where there's no light or cell phone reception and the only way out is to crawl even further downward, that's when you gotta start reassessing who you're hanging out with, because there's gotta be something better to do than that. Like, again, more power to you if you do this in real life, but for me, no way. Still, this movie deserves credit for getting as much out of its environment as it does. The Descent really leans in on the inherent scariness of its setting. It basically does what Underwater didn't do. It lays out an environment that is scary enough on its own, and then it kicks in its paranormal aspect, once we're already engaged with the story. The Descent could absolutely work as a horror movie, even if there wasn't something trying to kill them all. Because when you're underground, when you're squeezing through a hole to try to survive, you're not just vulnerable, you have almost nowhere to go. You have almost no escape route. And it's why the concept of this movie is kind of ingenious, because it's hard to think of a scenario where a group of characters could have less control in the location that they're stuck in. There aren't many places you'd like to be stuck in less than underground. Another thing the movie does well is it does a great job of establishing its cast as believable characters, even if what they're doing is something I would never do in a million years. The story centers on 6 outdoorsy women who are all friendly with each other, and the way they talk to each other and interact with each other is very true to life. In fact, this movie hits on something that a lot of movies with a big cast don't, which is the characters in The Descent, when they're in a group, occasionally talk over each other, which I know is a really small detail to focus on, but it's something you don't always see in movies, where sometimes dialogue can be very regimented. If you go walking in a group with like 5 or more people, and if a specific conversation hasn't been established for everyone, the people in your group will start to talk to one another. You'll hear sentence fragments and crosstalk, and maybe one of you will say something and maybe no one else will pick up on it. Or maybe it'll get drowned out by what someone else is saying. And maybe there'll even be multiple conversations going on at the same time. That's just the way people talk to each other normally. And The Descent recognizes that in its scenes early on, when these women are casually hanging out with each other, and when they're not in mortal danger. They come off as real people. And the reason why this stood out to me is because I have seen a ton of horror movies where the characters are at each other's throats so quickly, and the way they talk to each other is so unnatural, that you find yourself wondering, why do these people even like each other? How are they even friends? But that's not the case here, which is to the film's credit. The Descent has a runtime of 100 minutes, which is perfect. If anything, it probably could have gone even longer. The beauty, again, of its concept is that once they get in the cave, there's never a second where it's comfortable, or where you feel like the characters have a reason to relax, since even when they're not dealing with killer things, they still have to deal with a setting that's equally as treacherous, if not more so. The directing is also well done, and you can tell that this movie was made by someone who is a fan of 80s horror movies, because there are little inklings now and then where it feels like a John Carpenter film. Like every now and then, the score will lapse into this synth beat that's very reminiscent of the main theme from The Thing, and even the credits at the beginning of the film look like the font that you'd find in a Stephen King movie. The Descent is a good example of how you can borrow elements from previous films and still do something original that stands out on its own and isn't derivative. Whatever homages it has are never in it long enough to slow the film down, which is the way it should be. The Descent is a great movie, and it looks great too, which is impressive because it had a very slim budget. The only complaint I have with this movie is that in the version I saw, it has one of those Nightmare on Elm Street throwaway endings that I'm not a fan of. You know, not every horror movie has to end on a scare, especially when it doesn't make sense, and this has one of those endings where it's almost like the director was like, well, now that you think it's over, I'm gonna make sure you're really confused, and now it's over. And there's something else with that too. There is an alternate ending to this movie that I won't necessarily say is better than the main ending, but it actually explains something about the movie that the main ending doesn't. In The Descent, there are these little Twin Peaksian breaks in reality that don't ever quite add up in the end. But in the alternate ending, they do. And so, if you see this movie, and if you get the same ending that I got, you should also check out the alternate ending just to get more context. And if you do, it's hard not to come away thinking that the alternate ending must have, at one point, been intended to be the real ending. Because even if it isn't more to your liking, it unquestionably caps off the movie more definitively than the main one. That said, if you're a big horror fan, or if you're into slasher films, The Descent is close to a must-see for you. And what's unique about it is that it has almost no male characters in it at all. Or does it? I should also note that it pairs really well with a survival video game that came out in 2015 called Until Dawn. If you like The Descent, and if you're into video games, you will almost certainly like Until Dawn, and vice versa. So, one more thing to add to your queue. But yeah, on the horror scale, The Descent is terrific. It's tense and scary, and it never crosses over into being torture porn, which I'm decidedly not into. And that was actually another thing that kept me from approaching this film for a while. The cover poster for The Descent is really creepy. It's of the women stacked in the shape of a skull, and it was a little too effective at creeping me out, because for a while, whenever I saw it, I thought, ugh, is this gonna be Hostel? This looks like it could be too much. But it isn't. If you're familiar with horror movies, there's nothing in here that's gonna offend your sensibilities. Thankfully. And yeah, The Descent was good enough that it snapped me out of my creative rut and got me to produce this video. So, hey, it's gotta be worth something.